My mother deliberately served me burnt charcoal food for 20 years because I reminded her of Dad's mother. Now she eats alone. My mother could cook perfectly for everyone except me. When my sister came home, she got golden roasted chicken with crispy skin and tender meat. When my brother visited, he got perfectly pink steak with buttery mashed potatoes. When I sat at the table, I got blackened chicken that was charcoal outside and somehow still raw inside, or steak that looked like leather and potatoes that were half burnt, half cold. She'd watch me try to eat it and say I was too picky and should be grateful for home-cooked meals. When I was 8, I thought maybe I was imagining it. By the time I was 12, I knew it was deliberate. I also started noticing the other things. How she'd flinch when relatives said I looked just like Dad's mother, her mother-in-law who she'd always competed with. How her jaw would tighten when teachers called me gifted, or when I won awards at school. My siblings were good students, but I was the one who got early acceptance letters and scholarship offers. The one everyone said had such potential. But I noticed something else too. The burnt food got worse after I started standing up for myself. When I was 10, I'd questioned why I had to do more chores than my siblings. When I was 13, I'd pointed out that her story about what happened at church didn't match what actually happened. My dad never said anything because his food was always perfect. My siblings thought it was funny that I couldn't appreciate Mom's cooking. When I tried to make my own food, she'd stand in the kitchen saying I was insulting her abilities and making her look like a bad mother. The worst was holidays. She'd spend all day cooking this beautiful spread for Thanksgiving or Christmas. Turkey that everyone raved about, pies that looked like magazine covers, sides that had people asking for recipes. My plate would have turkey jerky, pie with burnt crust and raw filling, and sides that tasted like ash. She'd loudly announce that she made mine special just how I liked it while relatives watched me struggle to swallow charcoal. One Christmas, my grandmother, Dad's mother, pulled me aside and whispered that I reminded her so much of herself at my age. Mom overheard and her whole face changed. That year's Christmas dinner, my plate was worse than ever. I'd catch her watching me with this look I couldn't quite read. Something cold and satisfied when I struggled to chew the leather she'd served me. The breaking point was when I brought my girlfriend Amy home. Amy was confident and successful, the kind of woman who spoke her mind and didn't apologize for it. I saw Mom's expression when Amy walked in, that same look from the Christmas my grandmother complimented me. Mom served Amy this incredible lasagna with perfect layers and melted cheese while giving me a black brick that broke the fork when I tried to cut it. Amy noticed immediately and tried to switch plates with me, but Mom snatched them back, saying I had specific preferences. When Amy asked what preferences required burnt food, Mom said I'd been difficult about food since childhood, and she'd learned to just give me what I wanted. Amy looked at me, then at Mom, and said clearly, "That's interesting, because she's never been difficult about my cooking. She loves trying new foods. Maybe the problem isn't her." Mom's face went purple. That's when I decided to fix this permanently. Mom was hosting her church group's monthly potluck and had been bragging for weeks about the feast she was preparing. 20 women from her prayer circle would be coming to eat her famous cooking. She'd been planning the menu for a month and telling everyone how blessed they were to have her hosting. The morning of the potluck, I showed up early to help set up. Mom was suspicious, but I said I wanted to support her big day. While she was getting ready upstairs, I switched some things around in the kitchen. I turned off her timer system and changed the oven settings she'd carefully programmed. I moved her good pans to the garage and replaced them with the burnt ones she used for my food. When she came down and started cooking, everything went wrong. The first batch of chicken came out exactly how mine always did, black and smoking. She panicked and tried the second batch, but I'd adjusted that oven too. The vegetables turned to coal. The rolls became hockey pucks. The rice turned into a crusty mass. She tried to salvage things, but every single dish came out exactly how she'd been serving me for 20 years. The church ladies stood frozen around the dining room table, staring at the blackened disaster spread across every serving dish. I watched from the kitchen doorway as my mother's face turned bright red, her hands shaking while she tried to explain that something went wrong with her ovens. Rosemary picked up one of the rolls and it crumbled into ash between her fingers, falling onto the white tablecloth like dirty snow. The women looked at each other with wide eyes, nobody saying anything but everyone thinking the same thing. My mother kept talking faster and faster, saying the timer must have broken, the temperature settings must have gotten changed somehow. She'd cooked this exact menu 100 times before. Michelle picked up a piece of chicken, and the outside was pure charcoal, while juice dripped from the raw center onto her plate. Thelma touched the vegetables, and they left black marks on her fingers like she'd been handling coal. My mother's voice got higher and more desperate as she moved from dish to dish, trying to find something that wasn't completely ruined. The mashed potatoes had a burnt crust on top. The green bean casserole looked like it had been set on fire. Even the dinner rolls were hockey pucks that made a thunking sound when someone dropped one back onto the serving tray. My mother's eyes swept across the room and locked onto mine in the kitchen doorway. Her expression changed in an instant from panic to something else, something cold and knowing. She understood exactly what I'd done, and I watched 20 years of cruelty reflect back at me in that single moment of recognition. Her mouth opened like she was going to say something, going to call me out in front of everyone, but I turned and walked straight out the front door before any words could come out. I heard her voice rise behind me, calling my name, but I kept walking to my car. My hands shook so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The church ladies were starting to file out onto the porch, watching me drive away, and I could see my mother standing in the doorway with her face twisted up in anger and shame. I drove straight to Amy's apartment going way too fast, running a red light because I couldn't make my foot ease up on the gas pedal. When I got there, I practically fell through her door and collapsed on her couch, my whole body shaking from adrenaline. Amy sat down next to me and just waited while I tried to catch my breath and stop my hands from trembling. I told her everything that happened, how every single dish came out exactly like my food always did, how my mother's face looked when she realized what I'd done, how the church ladies stood there staring at the burnt mess. Amy pulled me close and held me while I started crying, not sad tears but something else, something that felt like 20 years of pressure finally releasing all at once. She stroked my hair and said I did what I needed to do, that standing up for myself after 2 decades of abuse wasn't petty or cruel, it was necessary. She said she was proud of me for finally fighting back instead of just taking it like I always had before. My phone started buzzing in my pocket over and over, the vibrations coming so fast they blended together into one long rattle. I pulled it out and saw text after text from my sister, each one meaner than the last. She called me petty and cruel and said I'd humiliated Mom in front of her entire church community on purpose. She said everyone was talking about it and Mom was crying, so hard she could barely breathe. My brother left a voicemail that I could hear was angry just from his tone before I even played it. He said I'd always been dramatic and made everything about me, and this proved I was the real problem in the family. He said normal people don't sabotage their own mother's cooking to get revenge for imaginary slights. I turned my phone completely off and shoved it between the couch cushions. Amy made me tea that I couldn't drink because my hands were still shaking too much to hold the cup steady. I tried to sleep on her couch, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face when she realized what I'd done. That moment when panic turned to understanding turned to pure rage. The next morning, someone pounded on Amy's apartment door so hard it sounded like they were trying to break it down. Amy looked through the peephole and mouthed that it was my father. I told her not to open it, but she said we couldn't just hide, and she unlocked the door. My father pushed past her into the apartment, angrier than I'd ever seen him in my entire life. His face was red and the vein in his forehead was sticking out, and he was breathing hard like he'd run up the stairs. He said I destroyed my mother's reputation and embarrassed the whole family in front of the most important people in her social circle. He said the church ladies were calling everyone they knew and spreading the story all over town. When I asked him about 20 years of burnt food, about how he sat there every single meal and watched me struggle to choke down charcoal while everyone else ate perfectly cooked food, he waved his hand like I was being ridiculous. He said that was between me and my mother and I should have handled it differently, like an adult instead of a spiteful child. Amy stepped between us and asked my father directly if he ever noticed that my food was always burnt, while everyone else's was perfect. She used her lawyer voice, the one that doesn't allow for excuses or deflection. My father's face changed and he admitted he'd noticed but thought I was just picky, and my mother was trying to accommodate my preferences. Amy's whole expression went cold in a way I'd never seen before. She told him that was either a lie or willful ignorance, and neither option made him look good as a father. She said watching your child suffer at every family meal for 20 years and doing nothing about it was a choice he made, and he didn't get to be angry now that there were consequences. My father's face got even redder, and he said the family needed to talk about this properly, all of us together without Amy interfering. He looked at me and said he expected me to come home and apologize to my mother for what I'd done. I stood up from the couch and told him I wasn't going anywhere near that house until Mother acknowledged what she'd done to me for 2 decades. I said I was staying at Amy's, and he could tell Mother that her perfect cooking reputation mattered more to him than his own daughter's well-being. He turned and walked to the door, then slammed it hard enough to rattle the frame and knock a picture off Amy's wall. Amy picked up the picture and checked that the glass wasn't cracked, then came and sat next to me again. 2 days went by with my phone still turned off and shoved in the couch cushions. Amy went to work and I stayed in her apartment, too scared to go outside in case I ran into someone from my family or the church group. On the 3rd morning, my sister called Amy's phone, which I answered because I thought it might be important. My sister was crying, so hard I could barely understand her words. She said Mother hadn't left her bedroom since the potluck, hadn't eaten anything, just laid in bed crying. The church ladies kept calling the house asking what really happened, and Mother told them I sabotaged her cooking, because I'd always been jealous of her talents. My sister's voice got quieter, and she asked if that was true, if I really did it out of jealousy. I heard something different in her voice this time. Not accusation, but actual doubt, like maybe she was starting to question the story Mother was telling. I took a deep breath and told my sister everything in detail. Every burnt meal from the time I was 8 years old. Every time the food got worse right after I won an award or got praised for something. Every holiday where I choked down charcoal while everyone else ate food that looked like magazine photos. Every family gathering where relatives watched me struggle, and Mother announced she'd made mine special just how I liked it. My sister went completely quiet on the other end of the phone, so quiet I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then she said in a small voice that she remembered me struggling with food, but she'd always thought I was just being difficult. She said she could picture it now, my plate versus everyone else's plates, and she felt sick thinking about how she'd laughed about it. The realization in her voice sounded like shame. My brother sent a text to Amy's phone an hour later, asking if we could meet for coffee without the parents there. I agreed, and we met at a diner across town where nobody from the family ever went. He ordered us both breakfast, and I watched him watch the server put our plates down, both of them perfectly cooked with golden hash browns and eggs that weren't burnt at all. He stared at my plate for a long time before he started talking. He said he never paid attention to what was on my plate at family dinners because he was always focused on his own food and his own conversations. But now that he was thinking about it, really thinking about it, he remembered me pushing food around and barely eating while everyone else had seconds. He said he felt sick thinking about all those family dinners and how he'd made fun of me for being picky when something else was clearly going on. My brother kept staring at his coffee cup, turning it around and around on the table. He said he's been thinking about Easter 3 years ago when I barely touched anything at dinner, and Mother announced loudly that I'd always been difficult about her cooking. He remembered everyone laughing while I sat there with a plate of blackened ham and burnt rolls. He said the memory made him sick now because he was part of the problem. I told him I appreciated him finally seeing it, but I needed time to process everything that was happening. We finished breakfast in awkward silence, and he hugged me before leaving, which felt strange because we'd never been the hugging type of siblings. Back at Amy's apartment, my phone started ringing. I'd turned it back on that morning and immediately regretted it. The caller ID showed my grandmother's number, my father's mother, who everyone said I looked so much like. I hesitated before answering because I didn't know what Mother had told her about the potluck disaster. My grandmother's voice came through calm but serious. She said Mother had called her crying about my betrayal and how I'd deliberately ruined her church event. But grandmother also said she'd gotten a different version of events from someone named Michelle Bailey, who was at the potluck. Michelle apparently told grandmother that the food situation looked suspicious and that she'd seen me in the kitchen before everything went wrong. Grandmother asked me directly if Mother had been mistreating me, and I could hear genuine worry in her voice instead of accusation. She said she needed to hear my side of what happened because something didn't add up about Mother's story. I sat down on Amy's couch and started talking. I told grandmother everything, starting with the burnt food from when I was 8 years old, and how it got worse every time I achieved something or stood up for myself. I described every holiday where my plate looked different from everyone else's, and how Mother would announce she'd made mine special. I told her about the Christmas when she'd pulled me aside and said I reminded her of herself at my age, and how Mother's face had changed when she overheard. I explained that my Christmas dinner that year was the worst it had ever been, with turkey so dry I couldn't swallow it and sides that tasted like ash. Grandmother went completely silent on the other end of the phone. The silence stretched so long I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then she said in a quiet voice that she'd suspected Mother resented her for years, but never imagined she would take it out on me like that. She apologized for not seeing what was happening, for not paying closer attention to the family dynamics when she visited. Her voice cracked when she asked what she could do to help now, if there was anything she could do to make up for not protecting me. I told grandmother I didn't blame her because she wasn't around for most of the meals, and Mother was careful about hiding it when other people were watching closely. I said the best thing she could do now was believe me, and maybe talk to my father about what he'd allowed to happen for 20 years. Grandmother promised she would have a serious conversation with him, and that she'd be reaching out to other family members to get their perspective on what they'd witnessed over the years. She said she loved me and was proud of me for finally standing up to Mother's treatment, even if the method was dramatic. We talked for another 20 minutes about specific incidents she could remember from family gatherings, and she admitted there were several times she'd noticed my plate looked different, but assumed it was just my preference. The next afternoon, Amy was at work, and I was alone in her apartment when my phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number, but I answered anyway. A woman's voice came through sharp and demanding. She introduced herself as Thelma Donovan and said she needed to speak with me about what really happened at Mother's potluck. My stomach dropped because I recognized the name from Mother's church group stories. Thelma was apparently very influential in the church community and took the group's reputation seriously. She said someone had told her they saw me in the kitchen before the food started burning, and now rumors were spreading through the church about what might have actually happened. Her tone suggested she'd already made up her mind that I was responsible. I told her I wasn't comfortable discussing family matters with her, and she said this wasn't just family matters anymore because it affected the entire church group's reputation. She wanted answers about why I would sabotage my own mother's event. Before I could respond to Thelma, my phone started buzzing with another call. It was Mother. I told Thelma I had to go and hung up on her mid-sentence. Mother's voice came through the phone screaming so loud I had to hold it away from my ear. She said I'd ruined her life and destroyed her reputation in the church community. She was crying and yelling at the same time, her words running together in this awful mix of rage and desperation. She said the church ladies were gossiping about our family and asking questions about what really happened at the potluck. She blamed me for turning everyone against her and making her look like a fool in front of people whose respect she'd spent years earning. I stayed quiet and let her yell, my hand shaking as I held the phone. She went on for several minutes about how ungrateful I was, and how she'd given me everything, and this was how I repaid her. When Mother finally paused to catch her breath, I brought up the burnt food. I asked her directly why she'd been serving me charcoal for 20 years while everyone else got perfect meals. Her tone changed immediately from angry to defensive. She said that was my imagination, and I was rewriting history to justify my cruel behavior at the potluck. She claimed she'd always cooked the same food for everyone, and I was the one who complained about everything she made. She said I'd been difficult about food since childhood, and she'd tried her best to accommodate my preferences, but nothing was ever good enough for me. I felt this cold clarity wash over me as I listened to her gaslight me so blatantly. I reached over to Amy's laptop and opened the voice recording app, then hit record. I told Mother I remembered very specifically how my food was always burnt while my siblings got perfect meals, and she laughed this bitter sound. She said I was delusional and always had been, that I saw problems where none existed because I needed attention and drama. She said my therapist should hear how I was making up abuse stories to get sympathy from people. I kept the recording going while she talked, capturing every word of her denial and blame. Amy came home that evening and found me sitting on the floor with my laptop open and papers spread around me. She asked what I was doing, and I told her about the phone call with Mother and the recording I'd made. Amy listened to the recording, and her face went hard. She said we needed to document everything, not just the phone call, but every incident I could remember from the past 20 years. She suggested I write down every specific meal I could recall with as much detail as possible, including dates if I remembered them, witnesses who were present, and exactly what was on my plate versus what everyone else ate. She said the pattern would be undeniable if we laid it all out in a document with that level of detail. We ordered takeout and spent the entire weekend going through my memories year by year. I started with the earliest incidents I could remember from age 8 and worked forward. Amy helped me organize everything into a spreadsheet with columns for date, occasion, what I was served, what others were served, who was present, and any relevant context like if I'd won an award recently or if grandmother had complimented me. By Sunday night, we had a document that was 12 pages long and covered hundreds of specific incidents spanning 2 decades. The pattern was impossible to miss when it was written out like that. Every major achievement in my life was followed by worse food. Every time I stood up for myself or questioned Mother's behavior, the next meal was more burnt than usual. Every holiday showed the same disparity between my plate and everyone else's. I sat there looking at the document and feeling this weird mix of validation and horror. Seeing it all in black and white made me realize how extensive the abuse actually was, how many meals I'd choked down while everyone else enjoyed perfect food. Amy printed out 3 copies and said we should send it to family members who might be willing to look at the evidence objectively. The next morning, my phone started ringing with calls from extended family members. My aunt called first, her voice tight with concern. She said Mother had been calling everyone in the family telling them I'd had some kind of breakdown and attacked her at a church event. Mother was apparently saying I was mentally unstable and needed help, that I'd always been difficult, and this proved I couldn't handle stress. My aunt wanted to know what was really going on, because Mother's story didn't make sense. I asked for her email address and sent her the document Amy and I had created. She said she'd read it and call me back. An hour later, my phone rang again, and my aunt's voice sounded shaken. She said she'd read through the entire document and felt sick. She remembered several family gatherings where she'd noticed my food looked different from everyone else's, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. She specifically remembered Thanksgiving 4 years ago, when my turkey was so dry it was falling apart while everyone else's was juicy and perfect. She said she'd assumed I'd just gotten an end piece or something, but now she was seeing it differently. She asked if I was okay and if there was anything she could do to help. My father called that afternoon, and his voice sounded different from the last time we'd talked. He sounded tired instead of angry, worn down by everything that was happening. He said Mother was devastated, and the church community wouldn't stop gossiping about our family. He needed this whole situation to stop because it was affecting their standing in the community and their relationships with people they'd known for years. He said the church ladies were asking questions and Mother was barely getting out of bed. I asked him if he'd read the document I sent to my aunt, and he admitted he hadn't. He said he didn't want to get involved in arguments between me and Mother because it would just make things worse. I felt this anger rise up in my chest. I told him his refusal to get involved had enabled 20 years of abuse, that his perfect meals had come at the cost of my suffering. He tried to argue that abuse was too strong a word, that Mother had just been difficult sometimes, but she'd never actually hurt me. I asked him what he'd call deliberately serving burnt food to one child while giving perfect food to everyone else for 20 years. I asked him what he'd call watching his daughter struggle to eat charcoal at every family gathering and doing nothing to stop it. He went quiet and then hung up without answering. That evening, I got a Facebook message from someone named Rosemary Donovan. She said she was a member of Mother's church group and needed to understand what happened at the potluck. Her message was polite but direct, saying the situation had caused a lot of confusion in the church community, and she felt she owed it to everyone involved to get the full story before making any judgments. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop the next morning, partly because I was curious what Mother had been telling the church ladies, and partly because I wanted someone from Mother's social circle to see the evidence. Amy offered to come with me, but I said I needed to do this alone. The next morning, I showed up at the coffee shop with a printed copy of the document. Rosemary was already there, a woman in her 60s with careful makeup and church clothes. She ordered us both coffee and we sat down at a corner table. I handed her the document and watched her face as she read through it. She took her time, going through each page carefully and occasionally making small sounds of surprise or concern. When she finished, she looked up at me and said she'd noticed things over the years that made more sense now. She said she'd seen Mother's face change whenever someone complimented me, this subtle shift in expression that she'd never been able to interpret. She remembered several church events where family members were present, and she'd noticed Mother seemed tense when people praised my accomplishments. Rosemary put the document down on the table between us and said the church group had been discussing whether to remove Mother from her leadership position. She explained that the potluck disaster had damaged the group's reputation because they'd been telling other church members for weeks about the amazing food Mother was preparing. When everything came out burnt, it reflected poorly on the whole group. She said if my accusations about 20 years of deliberate food sabotage were true, it changed how she viewed Mother's character entirely. She asked if everything in the document was verifiable, if there were witnesses to the incidents I'd described. I told her every incident had multiple witnesses because they all happened at family gatherings with other people present. I said she could talk to my siblings, my grandmother, my aunt, or any other family member who'd attended dinners over the years. Rosemary promised she would reach out to some of them to verify the pattern. She thanked me for meeting with her and said she needed to think carefully about what this meant for Mother's role in the church group. As she left, she touched my shoulder and said she was sorry this had happened to me, that no child should have to endure what I'd described. That afternoon, my phone rang with my sister's number. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Her voice sounded different, quieter than usual. She said she'd been thinking about family dinners all day, going through memories she'd always dismissed as nothing important. She remembered now that my food always looked different from everyone else's. The words came out slowly, like she was admitting something that made her uncomfortable. She said she thought it was funny at the time, that she and our brother used to joke about how I couldn't appreciate Mom's cooking. They'd laugh about my picky eating while they ate their perfect meals. Her voice cracked when she said she never considered that Mom was doing it deliberately, that she'd been too focused on her own plate to see what was happening right in front of her. She apologized for not taking me seriously all those years, for dismissing my complaints as drama. I sat there listening to her cry and didn't know what to say back. 2 nights later, Amy and I went out for dinner at a small Italian place downtown. We'd just ordered when I saw my parents walk through the front door. My stomach dropped. They spotted us immediately and headed straight for our table. My brother must have told them where we'd be. Mom's face was set in that determined expression she got when she'd made up her mind about something. She stopped at our table and said we needed to meet and resolve this situation, that the family couldn't continue like this. Amy put down her fork and looked up at my mother with a calm expression. She said ambushing us at dinner wasn't appropriate, and this wasn't the time or place for a family discussion. My father stepped forward and insisted we needed family therapy, that we had to work through this as a family. I looked at both of them standing there in the middle of the restaurant with other diners watching. I told them I'd agree to therapy, but only if Mom admitted what she did first, if she acknowledged the 20 years of burnt food before we sat down with any therapist. Mom's face went hard. her jaw tightening the way it always did when someone challenged her version of events. She said there was nothing to admit because she always cooked the same food for everyone, that I was the one making up stories to justify my cruel behavior. Amy pulled out her phone without saying anything and scrolled through her photos. She turned the screen toward my parents, showing the picture from the one family dinner she'd attended. The image showed both our plates clearly, my burnt brick of lasagna next to her perfect serving with melted cheese and even layers. Amy swiped to another photo showing the same contrast from a different angle. Mom's face went pale as she stared at the evidence. She hadn't realized Amy had been documenting it. My father leaned in to look at the photos, his expression changing as he saw the clear difference between the plates. The other diners were definitely watching now. Mom grabbed for Amy's phone, but Amy pulled it back. She said the photos were backed up in multiple places and deleting them wouldn't change what they showed. Mom's hands were shaking as she turned and walked toward the exit. My father stood there for another moment staring at Amy's phone screen. I watched something shift in his expression, like a wall cracking. He'd spent 20 years not seeing what was right in front of him, and now he couldn't unsee it. He looked at me and opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again. He didn't apologize, but his face looked shaken as he followed Mom out of the restaurant. The other diners slowly went back to their meals. Amy put her phone away and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. The next morning, my brother called. His voice sounded different, angry in a way I'd never heard before. He said he'd confronted our parents about the photos Amy showed them. Father had admitted he'd always noticed my food looked different, but convinced himself I was just hard to please, that Mom was accommodating my preferences. Brother said he couldn't believe Father let this happen for 20 years without saying anything, that he'd been complicit through his silence. I could hear him pacing as he talked, his footsteps echoing through the phone. He said he felt sick thinking about all those family dinners where he'd laughed at my struggles while eating his perfect meals. He kept saying he should have noticed, that he should have said something. My sister called that afternoon and asked if I could meet her for lunch. She said she had something to show me. We met at a cafe near her house and she brought a cardboard box with her. Inside were dozens of old family photos she'd gone through from holidays and birthdays over the years. She'd marked each one with a sticky note. Every photo showed family meals where my plate clearly had burnt food while everyone else's looked normal. Christmas dinner with my blackened turkey next to everyone's golden servings. Thanksgiving with my charred vegetables beside their perfect sides. Birthday dinners where my plate stood out like a punishment. She'd documented 20 years of evidence that had been sitting in photo albums the whole time. She said she was showing these to our parents whether I wanted her to or not, that she couldn't pretend anymore that this hadn't happened. That evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice introduced herself as Michelle Bailey from Mom's church group. She said several women had been discussing my mother's behavior over the years, and she needed to tell me something. Michelle admitted she'd noticed Mom would make subtle critical comments about me whenever I wasn't around, always framed as concern but with an edge to them. She'd mention my achievements but follow them with worry about how I might be getting too proud or ambitious. She'd talk about how difficult I was as a child, how I'd always challenged her authority. Michelle said the other church ladies were now reassessing interactions they'd dismissed at the time, seeing patterns they'd missed before. The next afternoon, someone knocked on Amy's apartment door. I opened it to find a woman in her 50s wearing church clothes and holding her purse tightly. She introduced herself as Mom's best friend from the church group. She asked if she could come in and talk. We sat in Amy's living room and she told me that Mom had called her sobbing about losing her church position. Mom blamed me for destroying her life over nothing, for being vindictive and cruel. But the friend said she'd known Mom for 15 years, and she'd seen things over that time. She'd noticed how Mom's face would change when people complimented me, this subtle shift in expression that she could never quite interpret. She'd watched Mom's jaw tighten when relatives praised my accomplishments. She said she was starting to believe my side of the story because the pieces were fitting together in a way that made horrible sense. 2 days later, my grandmother called and said she was organizing a family meeting at her house. She didn't tell me my parents would be there, but I knew they would be. Amy came with me for support. When we walked in, Mom was sitting on the couch and she stood up immediately when she saw me. She tried to walk toward the door, but Grandmother moved to block it. Grandmother said everyone was staying until we talked honestly about what had been happening in this family. Father sat in the armchair looking uncomfortable, but he didn't argue with his mother. My siblings were already there, sitting on opposite sides of the room. The tension made the air feel thick. My sister pulled out the box of photos and started laying them on the coffee table. Photo after photo showing years of burnt food on my plates while everyone else ate normally. Mom tried to claim the photos were taken from bad angles, that the lighting made the food look darker than it was. Grandmother cut her off mid-sentence. She asked directly why my food looked consistently different from everyone else's in dozens of photos spanning 20 years. The question hung in the air. Mom's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Father stared at the photos spread across the table, his face pale. My brother picked up one of the Christmas photos, studying it closely. The evidence was undeniable now, laid out in front of the whole family with nowhere left to hide. Mom's mouth worked, but nothing came out for a few seconds. Then tears started running down her face. She said she tried her best with me, but I reminded her, so much of grandmother, that cooking for me was hard. She wiped her eyes with shaking hands and said the resemblance bothered her, but she never did it on purpose. Maybe she was just distracted when she made my portions. Grandmother's whole body went stiff and her face turned hard as stone. She said that explanation was insulting to everyone's intelligence, and she wouldn't sit here listening to obvious lies. Mom flinched like she'd been slapped and opened her mouth to argue, but grandmother held up one hand to stop her. The room stayed quiet for a moment, nobody moving or speaking. Then my brother cleared his throat. He said he needed to say something he'd been thinking about since he saw the photos. He described that Christmas when grandmother pulled me aside and complimented me. Said he remembered it clearly now because my food got way worse right after that conversation. He said I could barely eat anything that day, and he thought it was funny at the time. Thought I was being dramatic about perfectly good food. Mom's face went bright red and she insisted that wasn't how it happened, her voice getting higher and sharper. She said my brother was misremembering things, that his memory was influenced by all these accusations. My brother shook his head slowly and said no. He remembered watching me try to chew that turkey and seeing the look on Mom's face while she watched me struggle. Amy reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen a few times. She said she had something everyone needed to hear and held the phone up, so the whole room could listen. Mom's voice came through the speaker, the recording from when she called me at Amy's apartment. In the recording, Mom denied everything and said I was mentally unstable, that I'd always made up stories for attention. She said the family needed to stop enabling my delusions and I needed professional help. The recorded voice sounded so calm and convincing, so reasonable and concerned. Father put his head in his hands and his shoulders slumped forward. My sister's eyes went wide and my brother's jaw dropped open. Mom stared at the phone like it was a snake about to bite her, all the color draining from her face. She tried to say something, but Amy kept playing the recording, letting everyone hear Mom call me a liar and claim the burnt food was all in my imagination. When the recording ended, nobody spoke for what felt like forever. Father finally lifted his head from his hands and looked at Mom with an expression I'd never seen before. He said he knew something was wrong, but didn't want to confront it because that would mean admitting his wife was deliberately hurting their daughter. His voice cracked on the word daughter, and he had to stop and take a breath. He said he told himself I was being too sensitive, or that it wasn't as bad as I claimed, anything to avoid facing the truth. He said he was ashamed of his cowardice and he should have protected me. Mom turned to look at Father with her mouth hanging open, like she couldn't believe he wasn't defending her anymore. She reached toward him, but he pulled back and she dropped her hand. Mom straightened up in her chair and her face changed, getting harder somehow. She said even if she did cook my food a little differently, I went way too far by destroying her reputation in front of her entire church community. She said what I did to her at that potluck was cruel and vindictive. Grandmother cut in before Mom could say more, her voice sharp as glass. She said 20 years of deliberate cruelty toward a child was worse than one incident of public embarrassment. She said there was no comparison between what Mom did to me and what I did to her. The room went completely silent, everyone processing what grandmother just said. My sister looked down at her hands and my brother stared at the floor. Father closed his eyes and Mom's face crumpled. Mom's phone rang and she jumped, fumbling to pull it from her pocket. She looked at the screen and her whole body tensed up. Grandmother said to answer it and put it on speaker, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Mom's hands shook as she tapped the screen and Rosemary's voice filled the room. Rosemary said the church group held an emergency meeting after talking to several family members who confirmed the food situation. She said they voted to remove Mom from her leadership position, effective immediately. Mom started crying harder, her shoulders shaking. She said her whole life was falling apart because of my vindictiveness, that I'd destroyed everything she'd built. I felt Amy squeeze my hand, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I spoke for the first time since the meeting started, my voice coming out steadier than I expected. I told Mom her life wasn't falling apart because of me. It was facing consequences because of her own actions over 20 years. I said I spent 2 decades choking down burnt food while watching everyone else enjoy her perfect cooking. I said one ruined potluck didn't even come close to balancing that scale. Amy squeezed my hand again and I felt her thumb rubbing small circles on my palm. My sister looked up from her hands and asked Mom directly why she did it. She asked what Mom hoped to accomplish by making me suffer at every single family meal. Mom's face twisted and fresh tears ran down her cheeks. She said every time someone compared me to grandmother or praised my achievements, she felt like she was losing to her mother-in-law all over again. She said she knew it was wrong but couldn't seem to stop herself from taking it out on my food. She said watching me struggle to eat made her feel like she had some control back. The room felt like all the air had been sucked out of it. Grandmother stood up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She looked down at Mom and said using a child as a stand-in for adult resentments was unforgivable. She said she was disappointed in the woman her son married. She said Mom needed serious therapy to figure out why she channeled decades of insecurity into hurting her own daughter. Father nodded his head, finally supporting his mother's words. Mom looked between grandmother and father like she was watching her whole world collapse. She wrapped her arms around herself and rocked slightly in her chair. Grandmother said the meeting was over when Mom agreed to get help, not before. Father said he'd already looked into family therapists and had 3 names ready. My sister said she'd go to family therapy sessions too if it would help. My brother nodded and said he would as well. Mom looked around at all of us and something in her seemed to break. She said she'd do individual therapy and family therapy sessions. Her voice was so quiet I almost couldn't hear her. She didn't apologize directly but admitted she handled her feelings about grandmother the wrong way. I took a deep breath and said I needed space and wouldn't be coming to family dinners until she made real progress in therapy. I said she needed to acknowledge the full extent of what she did before we could move forward. Mom nodded without looking up, still hugging herself and rocking slightly. Grandmother gathered her purse and said she expected weekly updates on Mom's therapy progress. Father walked grandmother to the door and they spoke quietly in the hallway. Amy helped me stand up, my legs feeling shaky after sitting tense for so long. My sister came over and hugged me tight, whispering that she was sorry she didn't see it sooner. My brother stood awkwardly nearby, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Mom stayed in her chair, staring at nothing, tears still running down her face. Amy and I left together after that family meeting, driving back to her apartment in silence because I couldn't find words for what I was feeling. My whole body felt heavy like I'd been carrying something for years and suddenly put it down, but my muscles still remembered the weight. Amy held my hand the entire drive and didn't ask me to talk about it, which made me love her even more. When we got inside, I sat on her couch and just stared at the wall while she made tea I didn't drink. My phone kept buzzing with messages from my sister and brother, but I couldn't look at them yet. The next 2 weeks were strange because I felt like I was waiting for something to happen, but didn't know what. I went to work and came home and tried to act normal, but everything felt different somehow. My sister called twice asking how I was doing and if I'd heard from Mom, and I said I was fine and no I hadn't. My brother texted saying he'd talked to Dad about finding a good therapist, and Dad actually listened this time. I didn't respond because I didn't know what to say. Amy suggested I start seeing someone too, because she said I'd been through something that needed processing, and I knew she was right, but the idea of explaining everything to a stranger made me tired. Then on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after the family meeting, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said she was my mother's therapist and asked if I'd be willing to come to a joint session. My stomach dropped and I asked why, and she said my mother had been working on something she wanted to share with me in a safe space. I told Amy about it that night and she asked what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know if I could sit in a room with my mother and listen to whatever she had to say. Amy said that was fair, but maybe it would help me get closure, or at least understand what was going on in Mom's head. I agreed to one session but told the therapist I might leave if it got too hard. The therapy office was in a building downtown with pale blue walls and plants everywhere trying to make it feel calm. When the therapist came out to get me, she was younger than I expected, with dark hair pulled back and glasses that made her look serious. She shook my hand and said she was glad I came, and I followed her into an office where my mother was already sitting on a couch looking smaller than I remembered. Mom's eyes were red and puffy like she'd been crying recently, and she was holding a folder in her lap with both hands. The therapist sat in a chair between us and explained that Mom had been doing intensive work around her behavior and wanted to share some of that work with me. I nodded but didn't look at my mother because I wasn't ready to see whatever expression was on her face. The therapist asked Mom if she was ready, and Mom nodded, opening the folder with shaking hands. She pulled out several pieces of paper covered in handwriting and started reading in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear. Mom read about the first time she deliberately burned my food when I was 8 years old, and someone at church said I looked just like grandmother. She described exactly what she made that day, and how she left it in the oven longer than needed while telling herself it was an accident. She read about my 10th birthday when I got an award at the school, and she served me cake that was burnt on the bottom, while everyone else got perfect slices. She went through Christmas dinners and Thanksgiving meals and random Tuesday nights, listing specific dishes and why she burned each one. Every entry had a reason tied to something I'd done or said or achieved that reminded her of grandmother, or made her feel like she was losing some competition she'd created in her head. She cried while reading and had to stop several times to wipe her eyes and catch her breath. The therapist handed her tissues and encouraged her to keep going. Mom read about the time I got early acceptance to college, and she served me chicken so burnt it was basically carbon, and she admitted she felt satisfaction watching me struggle to eat it. She read about bringing Amy home and how seeing another confident woman in her house made her want to punish me even more. The letter went on for pages and covered 20 years of deliberate cruelty spelled out in detail that made it impossible to deny or minimize. When she finished reading, Mom set the papers down and looked at me with tears running down her face. She said she was sorry, and she knew that wasn't enough, but she needed me to know she understood what she'd done and why it was wrong. I sat there feeling like something was breaking open inside my chest because hearing it all laid out like that made it real in a way it hadn't been before. The therapist asked how I was feeling, and I said I didn't know yet. She asked if I wanted to respond to what Mom shared, and I nodded even though my throat felt tight. I looked at my mother for the first time since entering the room and told her she didn't just ruin meals, she made me dread every family gathering for 20 years. I said I felt worthless in my own home because the person who was supposed to love me most was actively trying to make me suffer. I said I questioned myself, constantly wondering if I was imagining it or being too sensitive, and that doubt was almost worse than the burnt food itself. Mom's face crumpled and she said she saw the impact, but told herself I was being dramatic, and hearing me say it out loud made her realize how deep the damage went. The therapist nodded and said rebuilding trust would take months or years of consistent changed behavior, not just one apology or one letter. She said Mom needed to demonstrate through actions over time that she'd actually changed, and I needed space to heal and decide what relationship I wanted going forward. I agreed and said I wasn't ready to have regular contact yet, but I appreciated Mom doing this work. Mom asked if she could hug me, and I said no, not yet, and I saw hurt flash across her face before she nodded and said she understood. A few days later, Amy and I went to couples counseling because she said we needed to talk about how all the family drama was affecting us. I didn't think we needed it, but Amy insisted, so I agreed. Our therapist was an older woman with gray hair who asked us both what brought us in. Amy said she was worried about how much anger I was carrying and wanted to make sure I was healing, rather than just moving the pain into our relationship. I felt defensive at first because I didn't think I was taking anything out on Amy, but the therapist asked me to consider how stress from my family might be showing up in small ways. We talked about how I'd been more withdrawn lately and how I sometimes got irritated over small things that normally wouldn't bother me. Amy said she loved me and wanted to support me, but she also needed to protect herself and our relationship. The therapist helped us work on communication strategies and how to set boundaries with my family that felt good for both of us. She suggested I think about what level of contact with my mother felt safe and healthy, and that Amy and I should check in regularly about how family stuff was impacting us. By the end of the session, I felt less defensive and more grateful that Amy cared enough to make sure we stayed strong through all this mess. My father called me the following week sounding different from usual, less defensive and more tired. He said he'd started individual therapy, and his therapist helped him see how his passivity enabled abuse. I stayed quiet because I wanted to hear what he'd say without me prompting him. Dad said he was so focused on keeping peace and avoiding conflict that he sacrificed my well-being for his own comfort. He said he saw the burnt food and convinced himself it wasn't that bad, or that I was exaggerating, and he was ashamed of how long he let it continue. He apologized properly for the first time without any excuses or explanations, just a straight apology for failing to protect me. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him right away, and he wasn't asking me to, he just wanted me to know he was working on himself. I told him I appreciated the apology and I was glad he was in therapy, but I needed time to process everything. He said he understood, and he'd keep working on himself whether I was ready to reconnect or not. After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand, feeling something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding that he was actually trying. The church community drama kept going because apparently my mother's behavior had been noticed by more people than I realized. Thelma called me one afternoon and asked if we could meet for coffee. I was nervous because I didn't know what she wanted, but I agreed, and we met at a small cafe near her house. Thelma ordered us both coffee and then told me several church ladies were relieved someone finally called out my mother's behavior. She said they'd felt uncomfortable around Mom for years, but couldn't figure out why or didn't want to seem uncharitable. Thelma described how Mom would make subtle critical comments about other women's children or accomplishments, always framed as concern, but with an edge that felt competitive. She said watching Mom's food disaster at the potluck, and then hearing about what she'd done to me made everything click into place. Other women started sharing their own stories of times mom had made them feel small or inadequate, and Thelma said the church group was having serious conversations about how they'd enabled problematic behavior by staying silent. I thanked her for telling me and said it helped to know I wasn't the only one who'd noticed something was off. 3 weeks after the family meeting, my mother texted asking if she could cook dinner for just me and Amy. I stared at the message, feeling my stomach clench because the idea of eating food my mother prepared made me want to throw up. I showed Amy the text and she asked what I thought. I said I didn't trust it and didn't want to go, but Amy suggested I talk to my therapist first before deciding. In my next therapy session, I brought up the invitation and my therapist asked what scared me about it. I said I was afraid mom would serve me burnt food again, or that she'd act like everything was fine when it wasn't. My therapist said it could be a good test of mom's progress if I went in with clear boundaries and a plan to leave if things got uncomfortable. She suggested I respond to mom with specific conditions like Amy coming as support and us leaving immediately if mom started any old patterns. I texted mom back saying Amy and I would come for dinner, but we'd leave if anything felt wrong, and mom agreed without argument. The night of the dinner, I felt sick to my stomach the entire drive to my parents' house. Amy kept her hand on my knee and reminded me we could leave anytime I wanted. When we arrived, mom opened the door looking nervous and thinner than I remembered. She hugged Amy but didn't try to hug me, which I appreciated. Dad was in the kitchen setting the table, and he smiled at me in a way that seemed genuine but sad. We sat down, and mom brought out plates of food that looked perfectly cooked, and I stared at my plate trying to see if mine looked different from everyone else's. Amy noticed me checking and squeezed my hand under the table. Mom watched me with this scared expression like she was waiting for judgment, and I could see her hands shaking as she sat down. I picked up my fork and cut into the chicken on my plate, and it was actually cooked right with no burnt edges or raw center. I took a bite and it tasted like normal food, like what she used to serve everyone else, and I felt tears prick my eyes unexpectedly. I told mom the food was good, and I saw relief wash over her face so strongly she had to look away and wipe her eyes. During dinner, mom talked about what she was learning in therapy about patterns that get passed down through families. She said her own mother was critical and competitive with her, always comparing her to other women and making her feel not good enough. Mom admitted she unconsciously repeated that pattern with me because I reminded her of grandmother and triggered all those old feelings of inadequacy. She said understanding the cycle didn't excuse what she did, but helped her see how to break it going forward. Dad added that he was learning about his own family patterns of avoiding conflict and how that made him complicit in mom's behavior. My sister had texted earlier saying she wished she could be there, but she was glad we were trying. The conversation felt awkward, but real in a way our family talks never had before, like we were finally saying true things instead of pretending everything was fine. Mom asked if I'd be willing to do more family dinners, and I said maybe eventually, but I needed to see consistent change over time. She nodded and said she understood and she'd keep working whether I came to dinner or not. Grandmother showed up for dessert, which mom had apparently arranged without telling me. I was surprised but not upset because grandmother and I had always been close. Mom served pie that looked perfect on everyone's plate, including mine, and grandmother watched mom carefully like she was checking for problems. After we ate, grandmother asked mom to help her in the kitchen, and I could hear them talking quietly while Amy and Dad and I stayed at the table. Grandmother's voice was gentle, but firm as she told mom she never intended to compete with her or make her feel inadequate. I heard mom start crying and grandmother kept talking, saying she was sorry if she'd ever made mom feel less than. Mom said through tears that she'd built up resentments based on her own insecurities rather than anything grandmother actually did, and she was ashamed it took her this long to see it. Grandmother said they both needed to work on their relationship if the family was going to heal properly. When they came back to the table, mom's eyes were red, but she looked lighter somehow, like she'd put down something heavy. My siblings started making more effort after that dinner, texting me regularly and asking to hang out. My brother called one evening and said he felt guilty for all the times he laughed about my food or called me picky when I complained. He said watching our mother's behavior and hearing about the therapy work made him realize how blind he'd been to what was happening. He asked if we could get lunch sometime and just talk, and I agreed because I could hear genuine regret in his voice. My sister sent me a long message about how watching our mother's patterns made her think about the kind of parent she wanted to be someday. She said she never wanted to compete with her kids or make them feel worthless, and she was grateful I'd forced the family to confront these issues even though it was painful. I saved her message because it felt important to remember that something good was coming out of all this mess. 2 months passed and mom's therapist called asking if I'd come to a joint session. Mom wanted to make formal amends and needed me there to do it properly. I agreed but told Amy I was bringing her for support, and the therapist said that was fine. We sat in the small office with its beige walls and tissue boxes on every surface, and Mom pulled out several handwritten pages that shook in her hands. She read through 20 years of incidents, naming specific meals and specific reasons she'd burnt my food each time. The Thanksgiving when I made honor roll and she served me turkey that cracked my tooth. The Easter after I got into my first choice college and my ham was raw in the middle but charred outside. The birthday dinner right after grandmother told her I had her eyes, when my cake was somehow both burnt and frozen. Mom's voice broke multiple times, but she kept reading, taking full responsibility without making excuses or blaming her own childhood. She said she'd keep going to therapy whether I forgave her or not, and asked what she could do to repair the damage she'd caused. I sat there feeling strange because I'd waited 20 years to hear this. But now that it was happening, I didn't feel the relief I expected. I told Mom I needed consistency over time, not grand gestures or one big apology. Monthly family dinners to start, and we'd increase frequency if she maintained changed behavior. The therapist helped us write an actual agreement about boundaries and expectations, like a contract we both signed. Mom could cook, but I'd bring my own food for the first few months until I felt safe eating hers. She couldn't make comments about my weight, my career, my relationship with Amy, or compare me to anyone else in the family. If she broke these rules, I'd leave immediately, and we'd reset the timeline. Mom signed without arguing and asked if she could hug me, and I said not yet. Amy squeezed my hand as we left and told me she was proud of how I handled it. A few weeks later, Mom called and said she'd started volunteering at a women's shelter as part of her therapy homework. She was helping women who'd experienced family problems, and hearing their stories gave her perspective on long-term hurt. She said one woman talked about her mother criticizing her appearance for 30 years, and Mom realized that's what she'd done to me with food instead of words. She told me she was committed to becoming someone her future grandchildren could trust and respect, and I appreciated that she was thinking that far ahead. It felt like she was finally understanding that change had to be permanent, not just until things got comfortable again. Amy proposed to me on a random Tuesday while we were making dinner together. She said she didn't want to wait for some perfect moment because every moment with me was already perfect, and I cried while she put the ring on my finger. We called my family that night, and I was nervous about how they'd react, but everyone seemed genuinely happy. Mom asked if she could help with wedding planning, and I tensed up immediately, but she quickly added that she'd only help if I wanted, and she'd respect whatever boundaries I set. She even suggested including grandmother prominently in the ceremony since we were so close, which shocked me because that would have triggered her badly before. I agreed to let her help with small tasks and told her Amy and I were making all the actual decisions. The church community started accepting Mom back into regular activities but not leadership positions. Rosemary pulled me aside at the grocery store one day and said several women appreciated seeing someone take real accountability and do the work to change. She said Mom seemed different now, humbler and less concerned with maintaining her perfect image. Rosemary admitted she'd always felt uncomfortable around Mom's need to be the best at everything, but now Mom was asking others for advice and admitting when she struggled. I thanked Rosemary for giving Mom another chance, and she said everyone deserves the opportunity to grow if they're willing to put in the effort. 4 months after the potluck, we had Thanksgiving dinner as a family for the first time since everything exploded. Mom cooked for 2 days, and when we all sat down, she served everyone identical plates. She made a point of giving me the best pieces of turkey and the crispiest parts of the stuffing, and her hands shook as she set my plate down. I picked up my fork and took a bite while everyone watched, and the food was perfect. Actually perfect. The way it had been for everyone else my whole life. Mom's eyes filled with tears as she watched me eat without hesitation, and grandmother reached across the table to squeeze her hand. The gesture surprised me, but I understood it, grandmother recognizing that Mom was finally trying. After dinner, Dad pulled me aside into the garage where he used to hide when family tension got bad. He said he was proud of how I stood up for myself even though the method was dramatic and public. He admitted the family needed the shock of the potluck disaster to break through decades of denial and avoidance. He told me he'd started speaking up more when he saw problematic dynamics instead of staying silent, and he'd called Mom out twice recently when she started falling into old patterns. I could see he was trying, and I told him I appreciated it, even though part of me was still angry about all those years he said nothing. Mom asked if she could host my bridal shower, and I looked at Amy before answering. Amy nodded slightly, and I agreed with clear conditions about not taking over or making it about her. The shower went well with my friends and relatives filling Mom's living room, and Mom stayed in the background making sure everyone had food and drinks. At the end, she made a toast about how I'd always been strong and independent like grandmother, and she was grateful I didn't let her treatment break that strength. She said she was honored to be part of my wedding after everything that happened, and several relatives cried, including Mom herself. My sister hugged me afterward and whispered that she'd never seen Mom so genuine before. 6 months after the potluck incident, Mom and I had developed something that felt cautiously real. She still went to therapy every week and checked in with me about family dynamics, asking if certain comments or behaviors bothered me. The burnt food became a family story we could reference honestly, and Mom didn't get defensive when it came up in conversation. She'd actually brought it up herself at a family dinner, acknowledging how cruel she'd been and how much work she still had to do. My brother said it was weird hearing Mom talk about her own behavior so honestly, but it made him trust her more. My wedding day arrived with clear skies and perfect weather. Mom came to the bridal suite early and helped me get ready without any criticism or attempts to take over. She fixed my veil when it got tangled and made sure my dress laid right, and when I was finally ready, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. She told me I looked beautiful, and that Amy was lucky to have me, and I could tell she meant it without any hidden resentment or competition. Dad walked me down the aisle, and I saw Grandmother crying happy tears in the front row next to Mom. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had an actual family, instead of people I was related to who hurt me. The reception hall filled with guests sitting at white draped tables, and I watched my mother stand up with a microphone in her hands. She looked nervous in a way I'd never seen before, her fingers gripping the microphone tight enough that her knuckles went white. She cleared her throat twice before she started talking, and the room went quiet to listen. She said she wanted to share something important about her daughter, about me, and I felt Amy squeeze my hand under the table. My mother's voice shook as she talked about how I taught her what real love actually means, how it's about seeing your kids clearly instead of using them as targets for your own problems. She said she spent 20 years resenting me for looking like Grandmother and being successful, and she punished me with burnt food because she couldn't handle her own feelings. The room stayed completely silent as she admitted this in front of everyone, relatives and friends and church ladies all staring at her. She thanked me out loud for forcing the family to face uncomfortable truths that nobody wanted to talk about, and she said she was grateful I fought back instead of just accepting the abuse. When she finished talking, someone started clapping, and then everyone stood up and clapped for her, and I saw tears running down her face as she sat back down. Dad squeezed her shoulder and Grandmother nodded at her from across the room. Amy and I left for our honeymoon the next morning, driving to the airport with our suitcases in the back seat. I felt genuinely happy about my family for the first time in my entire life, like maybe things could actually be different now. My phone buzzed during the flight and I saw a text from my mother with a photo attached. The photo showed her standing in the kitchen cooking dinner, and both plates on the counter looked exactly the same with perfect portions of chicken and vegetables. The caption said, "Everyone gets the same food now," with a heart emoji after it. I laughed and showed Amy, and she smiled and kissed my cheek and said she was proud of how far we'd all come. 3 months after the wedding, Amy and I invited everyone to our new apartment for dinner. My mother showed up carrying a covered dish and looking anxious, like she wasn't sure if she was really welcome. We all sat down at our small dining room table, and my mother served everyone portions that looked identical, perfectly cooked chicken with roasted potatoes and green beans. I picked up my fork and took a bite without checking the food first, without that familiar dread in my stomach. The food tasted normal and good, the way everyone else's food had always tasted, and I realized I wasn't waiting for criticism or watching for that cold, satisfied look on my mother's face. We ate and talked about normal things like work and weekend plans, and the change felt real instead of temporary. Looking back now, the potluck revenge was messy and way too dramatic, but it forced conversations that never would have happened any other way. My mother still goes to therapy every week, and she still has work to do on herself, and our relationship isn't perfect or easy. But it's honest now in a way it never was before, based on her actual effort to change instead of me just accepting how she treated me. I'm proud of myself for fighting back after 20 years of burnt food and silent suffering, and I'm grateful for Amy supporting me through everything even when my family was a disaster. I'm cautiously hopeful that we can keep healing together as a family, that my mother can keep working on her problems, that my future kids won't grow up watching their grandmother punish one of them with deliberately ruined meals.